The most important holiday for Vietnamese Americans is Lunar New Year. Thousands of people attend this annual street festival. Many come to catch a bit of the New Year spirit, sample some Vietnamese dishes, and even to sing a little karaoke. New Year is a time to set aside one's past troubles and prepare for a prosperous year ahead. But letting go of the past is something this refugee community does not do well. Everywhere at the festival are symbols that no longer exist in Vietnam, like the pattern and colors of these balloons, and these Vietnamese veterans in their military outfits and the flag that flies behind them, and even the name Little Saigon. All these symbols represent a past. A past that divided Vietnam into North and South, communists and anti-communists. For nearly 2 decades, Vietnamese fought each other over the political direction of their country. Determined to stop the spread of communism, the United States backed South Vietnam and armed the regime with massive economic aid and military support that included 500,000 American soldiers. But without endless U.S. assistance, South Vietnam fell to the communists in the spring of 1975, ending what we call in America the Vietnam War. 35 years later, those who lost the war still dream of a Vietnam that is free of any trace of communism.
Rồi em nào đại diện một lời chúc Tết đi chú.
I'll do it since I'm the oldest.
Con chúc Tết chú một năm vui vẻ, có nhiều tiền như nết và thành sự như ý.
Tôi chúc các em lớn học giỏi để phục vụ cho cộng đồng, phục vụ cho đất nước Việt Nam nhé. Noi gương của các chú các bác phấn đấu cho tự do dân chủ cho Việt Nam, không để gì Việt Nam nó đè ép dân mình khổ lắm. Ok, Happy New Year.
Young people are not the only ones recruited to keep the fight against communism alive.
Hôm nay vui lắm. Sài Gòn đẹp, Sài Gòn ơi.
During the festival's opening ceremony, San Francisco's political machine joins in on this dream.
Ladies and gentlemen, today on the TED Festival to celebrate the Year of the Tiger, held at the Little Saigon area in San Francisco, we would like to ask all of you to join with us to send the balloon that carry our beloved yellow flag with the 3 red stripes back to our homeland, and we wish that someday democracy and freedom will be restored in Vietnam. 3, 2, are you ready? 1, let's go! Bravo! Happy New Year! Happy New Year! Happy New Year!
Less than 3 blocks away from the site of the New Year Festival lived a young Vietnamese community worker named Lum Dung. In the early 1980s, Lum resided on the 2nd floor of this building in a small, 1-room apartment. Unlike most Vietnamese Americans, Lum did not despise communism. In fact, he openly admired Ho Chi Minh and reprinted stories from Vietnam's state-run press in his monthly newspaper. On July 21st, 1981, Lum would be shot and killed on this sidewalk outside his apartment in broad daylight. An anti-communist group would claim responsibility, marking the beginning of a new kind of war.
I first met Lum back in Oberlin, Ohio, when I was a student at Oberlin College, and he was a student there, and we stayed in the same dorm called Asia House.
Oberlin College admitted people of all races and women as well, men and women of all races, as it says on the sign outside the city limits. So it's a town that was built on the notion of social justice and equality of opportunity.
This is a photo of Lum from the 1972 Oberlin High School yearbook. He is 17 at the time. AFS stands for American Field Service, a high school exchange program that sponsored Lum's education. Lum had come to America to avoid being drafted into the South Vietnamese Army. Originally, AFS sent Lum to Athens, Georgia, but according to family members, Lum encountered hate and racial discrimination there and requested to study in a more liberal town. He found refuge in Oberlin and went on to the college there, graduating with a bachelor's degree in math and philosophy.
The way I saw Lum was he was a very human person, very passionate about the world, and he talked a lot about his people back in Vietnam, and he thought that the consequence of the war in Vietnam was very unjust. You know, the United States was sending troops, and there was a lot of killings going on in Vietnam. And Lum was one. He really was very concerned, and what he always mentioned to me were he wished that things were better, and if there was a way to establish peace, who would be a part of it.
Xin cho tôi yên ngủ một ngày, xin cho đêm không có đàn bay, xin cho chim góp nhạc về trời.
After nearly 2 decades of fighting, the Vietnam War finally ended on April 30th, 1975, and Lum's country was reunified under communist rule.
I know that he sympathized with the communists in the Vietnam War, but it was, I think, because he wanted the country to be united. And I do remember this conversation with him. Had Ho Chi Minh simply been allowed his victory in the 50s against the French at Dien Bien Phu, that Vietnam would be exactly where it was in 1975, without all the bloodshed, the loss of life, the dislocation, the terrible division in the country.
When our intelligence forces brought in their reports warning that if the election called for by the Geneva Accords for July 1956 were held, Ho Chi Minh would be elected president in South Vietnam by at least 80% of the vote. And our country that boasts about believing in self-determination used its power and its prestige and its influence really to get our first puppet government under GM not to cooperate in holding those elections. That's just a matter of historic record.
And I can't say that I disagree with him. I mean, I myself was born in a country that was badly battered and divided many times. And, what is always done for political reasons never really seems to help people. And I think he was someone who was very interested in people.
Mary Kurtz is the daughter of refugees who fled Ukraine during World War II. When the Vietnam War ended, Mary volunteered to sponsor Lum's family, one of the hundreds of thousands of refugees who fled Vietnam fearing communist retaliation for their ties to the Americans and the South Vietnam regime.
When I met Lum, it was really, the focus was, why did I want to sponsor his family? Because Lum was always anti-war. He didn't want someone to sponsor his family who was doing it for patriotic reasons or something like that.
With his family now in the States, and because of fears that he would be treated with suspicion by the communists, Lum decided to remain in America. In the summer of 1976, after graduating from Oberlin, he moved to San Francisco with his college girlfriend, Joanne.
College was coming to an end. I had no plans, and he just said how he was looking for the Asian community, and he was going to go to New York or San Francisco. And he just asked me if I wanted to come. So yeah, it sounded like a cool thing to do.
Once in California, Lum quickly located a growing community of Vietnamese refugees living in the Tenderloin neighborhood of San Francisco. It would be in the Tenderloin that Lum's name would become increasingly known to Vietnamese refugees all over America. Within a year of living in San Francisco, Lum had already worked at a bank and for a refugee resettlement center before taking the leap to start his own community group.
He worked at the bank probably at least 6 months, maybe close to a year. And then he worked with Michael Huyn's group for a short time. And I remember him coming home and kind of being critical of Michael and the group, what they were doing or maybe what they weren't doing, and just announcing that he was going to go up against them and try and take their funding. I guess there were federal grants available, so instead of trying to help them get the grant, he was going to try and get that grant himself and start his own group. And I remember at the time thinking, well, how could you do that? You know, you've only been there a short time. But he was really smart. You know, obviously he spoke English like a native. He picked stuff up very quickly. I'm sure, you know, maybe working for that group, he learned how to write grants.
In the fall of 1977, at the age of 23, Lum founded the Vietnamese Youth Development Center, also called the VYDC, to serve the refugee population in the Tenderloin. Described in most tourist guides as the worst neighborhood in San Francisco, the Tenderloin became home to thousands of poor Southeast Asian refugees in the late 1970s after the Vietnam War.
The thinking of that time is I think there was a lot of cheap housing. You know, even though the neighborhood is not like super safe, but there was cheap housing. And also there's a lot of absentee landlord. So, for example, you can rent a studio and then you can have 4 or 5 people live there.
Glide Memorial, a progressive church in the heart of the Tenderloin, allowed Lum to operate the VYDC out of 2 of their small offices.
The mission that Lum developed, and I think that a theme that is kind of carried on through VYDC's existence was really to involve young people in the development of their community. That was the mission statement that he wrote up from the start. It's kind of twofold. There's the, meeting like very immediate needs like employment, education, counseling. And then there's also the more community involvement type of activities. Community arts has been a big thing. Video production, drama, sponsoring community events led by youth.
To Do was one of these youth. She was a senior in high school when she first met Lum and became a part of the VYDC.
As I look back, there's a couple of things. I think with youth, it's just like, okay, there's a job, right? There's employment job, and there's a place to hang out that nobody's gonna judge you. And then we have some fun activities. And I think for the community, people need somewhere to help them with those complicated forms, and we're providing that. We're not just only like filling out form for people, we actually fight with the Department of Social Services when they don't respond to the applicant X number of time. And people who come to our agency who would say that, we come here because you really help us all the way.
I think he always saw himself I think he actually hated that term of social services. I think that he was more into really organizing and working in the area of community development.
Yet the community Lum wanted to organize did not agree with his political views. Lum was happy that the Vietnam War was over and that his country was reunified. He even had a photo of Ho Chi Minh up in his tiny office. But to many of the newly arrived refugees who lost their status, loved ones, and homeland, the wounds of the war were still too raw and painful.
You had all these refugees who were fleeing what had been done to them, which he had not experienced himself, but what had been done to them or their families by the Vietnamese government, both before the war ended and after the war ended. And so they brought that anger with them. So when you have someone like him who has this kind of more liberal take on things, because he really was, at that point, really more of a typical American teenager, young person. It was not well received. And the perception was in the community that he was a communist.
My impression at that time was even though the war was over in 1975, it wasn't quite over yet here among the Vietnamese. There's still a conflict. Well, most of the Vietnamese people were too busy surviving to be bothered by the ideological differences, and they benefited from his services, actually. But there are some who didn't like his political ideology. They thought he was too liberal, too Americanized, or too young.
I think the American government is deliberately trying to destroy the culture of Vietnam itself. I think there's a term for it, which is ethnocide or something, making people less proud of themselves, believing in the values of the American system, believing in something that is very foreign to them.
For the community here, I think that there was always an acknowledgement by a lot of people that Lum was one of the few people they could actually turn to who would be sincere in helping them. I heard that a lot. So I think that that's all that mattered. If there were other people, so-called community leaders who were older or whatever, there may have been reactions, but that wasn't what we were focused on.
Despite the brewing accusations that he was a communist, Lum continued to be outspoken and told his critics, "If you think I'm a communist, then prove it." In 1978, Lum produced and hosted a Vietnamese radio program on KUSF at the University of San Francisco. While the content of the program focused on refugee rights, rumors spread among the Vietnamese in California that Lum was using the airwaves to broadcast communist propaganda. After 6 shows, the radio program was suspended due to protests by right-wing Vietnamese, but an investigation by KUSF found the allegations against Lum to be false, and the program was put back on air for the remainder of the contract.
From what he told me, there was nothing in the KUSF program that should have garnered that kind of response.
2 years later, in the spring of 1980, Lum officially stepped back from the VYDC and accepted a new position that allowed him to focus on projects beyond social services.
So I think he doing that is transition himself away from VYDC, right? So whatever the stand that he'll take controversial in the community won't be affecting the program that we running, right? Even though the center is so much about him, so it's difficult to distinguish that.
He was still involved in VYDC. He was still there. He still worked out of VYDC's offices. So it's not like he left the organization.
One of Lum's chief responsibilities in this new position was to publish a newspaper that would inform Vietnamese refugees of their rights and expose them to news inside Vietnam. Lum called the newspaper Cái Đình Làng, or the village temple.
The name Cái Đình Làng meaning that the village temple is very traditional in the sense that the Vietnamese use Cái Đình Làng as a communal meeting place where they decide things. The main aim of his is a forum for the community to express themselves, and he had a section for people to write to him, asking him about different issues about Vietnam, also the U.S., and he answered all this letter from the readers.
The content, I know, like some of them, there are a couple of the articles that he wrote, but a lot of them are from Vietnam, news from Vietnam, and from radio station that focus in Vietnam.
The newspaper was also distributed to a mailing list of Vietnamese homes, unsolicited. So I think that a lot of people were very angered by that.
Using a mailing list he obtained largely from telephone directories, Lum sent his newspaper to over 4,000 Vietnamese refugees across California. While he knew that many of his potential readers would be hostile to the liberal stance of the paper, Lum felt that at the very least, the Vietnamese American community would be exposed to all available news and views. But some refugees did not share Lum's desire. Instead, his newspaper only deepened their conviction that there was a communist in the community whose activities needed to end.
There was a lot of letters coming in. There was pressure put on Glide Memorial Church to evicting us out of the building.
At least once, and maybe twice, the Vietnamese community came to Glide and demonstrated, had a rally in front of Glide offices, in front of Glide Church. And it was directed to Lam, who they accused of being a communist.
When there was protests, there's a lot of people wearing the ex-military uniform. So I assume that they ex-military organization. So they were protesting in front of Glide, and vocal and chanting and screaming. God, I was just thinking like 50, 60 people.
Men and women just...
Men and women mix. It's like a lot more, not younger, but more like middle-aged. At that time, I think it's like our parents' age, like 40, 50s.
Lam was, in their minds, the most visible target to express their anti-communist feelings, the community feeling of Vietnamese who were really against anything that resembled communist support.
The hatred towards Lum grew even more widespread when community leaders learned that the VYDC had received a federal grant that was awarded to only 30 refugee groups around the country.
Yeah, VYDC did get funding from the feds, and that offended some other Vietnamese organizations nationally that Lum would get funded, right, given what his reputation was. I know that according to federal rules, they had already given the grant. They couldn't take it back. And then there was a grantee meeting in Washington, D.C. Lum didn't go, but I went. And maybe because I was there and he wasn't, nothing happened. And it was with all those organizations that were protesting. So it was kind of interesting, because I was prepared, like, what's going to happen, but nothing ever happened, so.
Yet something would happen that would forever change the VYDC and the Vietnamese American community.
Lum and I were working together, trying to put together a proposal for VYDC. And he was actually writing the grant. And I think I was helping with like getting support letters and some of the other things needed for the proposal. And right before he left the office, because he knew that we had this deadline in a couple of days, he wanted to reassure me that he wasn't going to be out for a long time. He told me that he would be back soon, that he wasn't going to be gone for long. And so he left the office, and that was the last time I saw him.
Lum had been at the office of Vietnamese Youth Development Center at Glide Church. He left there, I believe, sometime between 10:30 and 11 a.m., told a co-worker that he would be back soon. He walked, I guess it was the 1.5 blocks from there to his apartment building. Lum was talking with either one or two Vietnamese men in front of his apartment building at 545 O'Farrell Street. He was shot in the left chest area near the heart.
I got a call that he had been shot. My first reaction was, well, how is he? You know, not thinking that it could be the worst. And then the response was, he's dead. And then they told me it happened like near his apartment. So I grabbed another VYDC staff and we walked up there.
The strong anti-Lam feeling that many of the community had was finally expressed in terms of I called it an assassination of Lam. And my worst fears were realized.
The belief that Lum was assassinated didn't come out of thin air. 4 days after his murder, the Associated Press in New York City received a communique postmarked July 21st, the day Lum was killed. The communique was signed by an unknown group who called themselves the Anti-Communist Witz Organization. The group claimed they had executed Lum for being a communist agent and for publishing his newspaper. The communique also warned Vietnamese refugees to not take advantage of the freedom of the free world. Within a week of the first communique, Vietnamese newspapers in California received another letter, this time written in Vietnamese and entitled Communique Number 2. In addition to reiterating the claims of the first letter, the second communique accused Lum of using his newspaper to criticize anti-communist freedom fighters. This second communique was signed by a group that the FBI would later refer to as Vo Sern, the Vietnamese organization to exterminate communists and restore the nation. Was Lum's murder a political assassination, or was he killed for personal reasons?
There was a real mystery. I think the reporters weren't able to pin it down to any person who killed Lum. They were trying to follow all kinds of leads, but I think the community was in such fear that if they knew anything, they were going to keep silent. So it was a way that the whole community, Vietnamese community, silencing those who might have had the courage to give some hints to the reporters, to the police who were trying to find some leads to Lum's killing.
The police predominantly looked at any personal motives, and certainly there were personal motives there. And that's kind of natural. And a lot of that's because there really wasn't an understanding of the possible political motives.
They were aware that there was opposition to him in the Vietnamese community, that there were essentially a lot of people who hated him because of his political posture, because of the newspaper he published, that there had been threats against him. But a lot of their investigation focused on the individuals who were in his circle.
I think it's like from that experience, I never really liked the police, at all. First of all, there's two inspectors that I assigned, and Kendrick, and the other one is, I can't remember, but I can remember their faces. One is kind of skinny, the other one is a little bit more fatter. And it's like, I just remember like they create such a fear among us, like doubt among ourselves with each other, It's like you're scared because the story that they put together, it's about the disagreement because we were fighting among ourselves for money. It's just like, it's just scary because one, that's not what it is. And two, is like, how could you not believe that there are people out there who execute him because of what he believes in,
I think they focused a little more than necessary on the idea that most homicides, or many homicides, are committed by individuals who are known to the victim. They based that on a number of things. First of all, the fact that a couple of witnesses said he appeared to be talking to the assailant before he was shot, implying that he may have known this person. By the fact the weapon used was a very small caliber weapon, a .25 caliber pistol, which often is not very reliable if you're trying to kill someone.
But on the other side, was that because that's all the person could get access to at the time? So, we'll never, that's a problem, we'll never know. Somebody out there knows. Somebody does know. And until that person comes forward, has the courage to come forward, we'll never know.
He was an activist. He was outspoken. He put together a community center. So does that make him a bad person? No. Everybody's got their own right of what they believe in. The thing is, this may not have been politically motivated, but people are trying to boost their image of their particular view, party, or whatever by saying that they were part of the homicide here. This could have been all over someone who borrowed money and never paid it back. As simple as that. But by not having people come forward and say, hey, this is exactly what the argument was about, we'll never know.
No one has ever been convicted in Lum's murder, so the motive behind his death remains a mystery. But Vo Sern, the shadowy group that claimed they executed Lum, would continue to terrorize this new American community.
but these are American reporters working in this country and being killed because of what they have written.
To a militant minority, sending help and discussing normal relations between the U.S. and Vietnam are political acts not tolerated.
In the early 80s, with the war just having finished, you had an organization that had broad-based appeal in all of the United States, all of the overseas Vietnamese communities, all of the countries that had Vietnamese, displaced Vietnamese, Australia, Britain, France, Germany, to name a few. This organization was the National United Front for the Liberation of Vietnam. The front, as it's called, was headed up by a one-star admiral, a well-thought-of fellow who got support unofficial support by our government following the end of the war. The Americans lost the war. So if you get a guy that says he's anti-communist, he fought against the communists, and he's saying that he can maybe retake Vietnam with guerrilla forces stationed in Southeast Asia, amen, let's do it.
Đã đảo Cộng sản, đã đảo, đã đảo Cộng sản, đã đảo. Việt Nam muôn năm, muôn năm. Việt Nam muôn năm, muôn năm. Việt Nam muôn năm, muôn năm.
Anybody who's Vietnamese who says we have problems with that, you better be careful who you're talking to. Any journalist or any significant person who is talking anti-front, that the front is a joke, it's a scheme to defraud, caught a lot of grief. And there are incidences in law enforcement where they were murdered.
When newsletter publisher Lam Trong Duong was shot to death in front of this building in 1981, San Francisco police wrote it off as a standard street crime. But Ana Arana, in her Committee to Protect Journalists report, says within a week, a group identified by law enforcement specialists as an enforcement arm of the front had claimed the murder as an act of terrorism.
I mean, you got to remember when we study, political violence and terrorism, I mean, it has some objectives. In this case, what they wanted to do was they wanted to stop, the publication of advertisements or coverage that they perceived to be favorable towards Vietnam. They wanted to send a message that you better not do it or you'll face, death. And they wanted to silence other voices in the community who were far more liberal than they were.
After Lum's murder in 1981, 4 other Vietnamese journalists and a Vietnamese left-wing activist were killed in the United States between 1982 and 1990. Through communiques, Vo Sern claimed credit in all but one of the killings, prompting law enforcement to investigate.
At that time, I opened up a case on the front and was working as a U.S. Marshal out of the strike force in San Francisco, and we started taking grand jury testimony on the front. That case went down the road. Part of the case was adopted by the FBI as a separate investigation. The acronym was Vo Sern, and Vo Sern was opened up as a terrorism case. The concern was that there seems to be a pattern here that journalists are getting murdered.
Now, our Los Angeles office had been looking at the situation of Vo Sern since not too long after Tap Van Pham's arson murder.
It was a firebomb that killed publisher Tap Van Pham. His Vietnamese language magazine reported entertainment news, but it was the advertisements he ran that apparently cost Pham his life.
Then I started getting leads from Los Angeles and from our Washington field office after Leigh Truett was murdered. They were assigned to me to try to bring everything together because we had had the murder of Lam here, the first murder, and the attempted murder and successful murder of Louis and his wife here in San Francisco, and they wanted to try to see if there was a pattern here, if there really was a group, Vo Sern, who was responsible, was committing these acts, which in essence constituted terrorism because the whole point was to instill fear and to intimidate and silence the critics, be it the critics of the front or people who in any way were perceived to support the Vietnamese communist regime.
I asked To Do what it means to be perceived as a communist in the Vietnamese American community.
You can see, like, you go into community places or something, people sort of look at you differently, but also they name you, like, you know, they be on the media and said that you are cán bộ, you know, that's a term in Vietnamese, cán bộ, a communist agent, right? And so they harm your family, they're trying to harm your family. And again, I mean, I understand, you know, there's people who lost their families and, you know, who lost their status in their lives, so they come to this country, so they have a lot of bitterness, you know. But let me give you an example. Once in a while, I run into like really good friends, people who, they say, God told you know that this is what they said about you. And I say, first of all, I don't even know what communist is, okay? And I'm not even like agent of the communists, you know. I happen to work at the agency and I do support Lum, and, you know, we all have our own thinking, so, you know, and then during that time I was just like, well, that's what they said, and time will tell whether it's true or not.
I mean, real stories here. This isn't Hollywood, this isn't anything like that. I mean, and then in some of those jurisdictions, law enforcement was having a heck of a hard time because they hadn't been as progressive, or they hadn't taken time out to smell the roses as to what was going on, and they didn't know what to think. What's going on here? Communism, anti-communism, what up with that?
The police just doesn't want to have to deal with political. One is maybe they don't have the capacity to understand it. It is complicated. And two is that they don't believe that it could be that heated, right? Unless you live in the community, you can't really understand the heat.
It was so foreign. It was really like working an investigation in a foreign country. We didn't understand the Vietnamese culture. We didn't speak the language. For the police officers that had to respond, the detectives that had to work these cases initially, it was, you know, I mean, most police departments, they're putting out forest fires. They've got a murder here, and then 2 days later they got another murder. And to try to work an investigation where you can't even pronounce the victim's name, and you don't understand that the last name goes first and the first name goes last, and you don't have anybody that wants to talk to you because of that, I explained, that element that came with them from Vietnam where you just didn't say anything.
I don't think it's wise to allow people to use free press to, you know, issue criticism each other.
I have to believe that because of the aggressive stance that I took, with the assistance of other agents and the police officers in the respective jurisdictions, the detectives, that we touched the nerve, the right nerve, because the murder stopped. And I will tell you, a lot of the investigation was focused towards the front, towards their leaders, and towards their staunch followers. Do I think the leaders themselves actually did any of these murders? No. Do I think they could have been responsible for ordering these murders? Yeah. Yeah. These were people in their own country, particularly during the wartime. They had ordered murders, you know, to their subordinates. Go take this guy out. So were they capable of doing that? Yes, I certainly think they were. And were there people that would follow them and do that? Yes. Yes, there were.
Some critics believe that the U.S. government during the Reagan administration played a role in supporting the front.
At a tacit, informal level, folks in the Pentagon were supportive of any group that laid claim, that had some legitimacy and laid claim to the ability to reconstitute the country of Vietnam in a non-communist way.
Support for freedom fighters is self-defense and totally consistent with the OAS and UN charters. We must stand by all our democratic allies, and we must not break faith with those who are risking their lives on every continent from Afghanistan to Nicaragua.
Who in the U.S. government may have offered tacit support to the anti-communist freedom fighters in the Vietnamese American community? Several individuals I interviewed have reason to believe that Richard Armitage, a Vietnam veteran who served in the first Reagan administration, was the front's go-to guy.
He was a part of national politics at the time. He was a personal buddy to Admiral Min in Vietnam prior to his leaving the Navy and going in to work for the agency. So he was the go-to guy for this tacit support for the front. And this particular guy in that agency had a lot of clout. What they didn't do is stop and smell the roses in terms of the legitimacy to that organization. And it's it's an embarrassment. But later this guy has surfaced, in politics with the last administration. As a matter of fact, I subpoenaed him to the federal grand jury, and he didn't come.
Is this allegation true? Did Richard Armitage provide tacit support to the front? And if so, in what way?
Speaking as a reporter who's written a lot about covert operations and matters of U.S. national security, I can say that it is very difficult as a reporter to actually get any sort of answers like that when the agencies that you're writing about don't have to answer any questions because of their claim that doing so would somehow jeopardize U.S. national security. Now, my conclusion is that anything that happened involving reporters who were murdered for stories that they wrote on U.S. soil is a matter of basic justice that needs to be answered for by the people that committed these crimes. The U.S. national security really doesn't come into play, in my opinion. We're talking about murder, and what that has to do with U.S. national security when somebody accused of being soft on communism is murdered in the United States of America. I mean, that's something that should be investigated, and all effort needs to be made to try to bring the people to justice.
I'd like to think that Voserun would never surface again, that we hit the right nerve, that they realized that we knew who they were, and if somebody broke, that they were all going to be in serious legal problems.
We never really found out what Voserun is. No one from Voserun has ever been arrested. We don't know if there is a Voserun, and if there is, they indeed got away with murder.
You see, you have to understand, if you're talking about Vietnamese Americans, those people that are making great contributions to general society, having wonderful things happen, are part of the 21st century, it's all a result of the war. See, the subject we're having is a part of the war. Had the war not occurred, or had not the U.S. involved themselves in the war, Juan Comín, the admiral, would have never been here to start the front, to start the killings. See, one is part and parcel. So the war is still with us. It's still with the Vietnamese Americans. It's a legacy that will last for a long, long time. People free associate, Vietnamese, Vietnam War. They won't understand, the political history of it. They won't understand that at least four political administrations in this country were no more than horse traders who didn't have anything involved. None of their families served. They were horse traders. But as a result of the war, now we have subjects like this.
So have any of these murders been solved?
No.
So how are they classified within, local jurisdiction and then federal?
I don't really know. I can only speculate. There is no statute of limitations on homicide. So certainly anything I say, I don't want it to come back, because if any of those cases could ever be solved, if someone ever, like on a deathbed confession, came forward, I mean, that would be wonderful for the victims' families. There'd be some final closure. It would be wonderful, I think, for the community, too. They're probably, I would imagine they're like in a pending and active status. They're not closed. You can't close a homicide case without a resolution. And they can be actively reinvestigated at any time if there's a reason to do so.
3 days after his death, Lum was laid to rest in the Vietnamese section of Los Gatos Cemetery near San Jose, California, home to one of the largest Vietnamese American populations. Reverend Hananoka attended Lum's funeral and will never forget what happened.
Velma Emoto and I drove to the cemetery, and Lam's family and friends were already there by the gravesite. Soon after we arrived, the Buddhist priest came, and I recall him starting the incense burning, and he started to chant. And all of a sudden, he left. And we all thought that he probably went to a restroom or something. But he didn't come back. So a few minutes later, one of the young people went to look for him. And then he came back and saying to us, he's gone. He's left us. And then I talked to the family and volunteered my service because I was a clergyman and wanted to complete the service. One of the passages I read must have been Paul's letter to the Corinthians, where Paul said how frail human lives are, and yet we look to the things that cannot be seen, for what we can see are only temporary. On the other hand, what we cannot see is eternal. And I encouraged people to look to what cannot be seen about Lam, his vision, his compassion, his passion for peace and justice and what is right.
About 2 weeks after the funeral, Lum's father requested that his body be dug up due to protests by Vietnamese refugees who did not want a suspected communist buried near their relatives.
That the family had to disinter his body because of protests in the community because he was buried in a Vietnamese cemetery. So these things were all very, very hurtful on top of everything else that was happening. I don't think that those sentiments were, everybody in the community, but those are the things that we heard, which were quite disturbing.
Lum's family had his body cremated and his ashes spread along the Pacific coast. He was 27 years old. By the early 1990s, the Front had lost tremendous credibility in the Vietnamese American community. 5 of its top leaders were indicted in 1991 on federal charges of conspiracy to defraud the IRS, and people began to realize that the Front was not at all what it claimed to be.
The Front was a joke. It was manufactured.
With the demise of the Front, the killings stopped. But strong anti-communist feelings continued to linger in the community, impacting the younger generation.
Well, this is 2 days before the election on Tuesday, and this is really our rally in support of recalling Madison Nguyen.
Madison Nguyen is the first Vietnamese American council member in San Jose, California. She was branded a communist for not naming a business district Little Saigon. In March 2009, Madison faced a historic recall election that cost the city of San Jose $500,000.
Yes, recall Madison! Vote yes, recall Madison!
It's just amazing to see so many people that come out to fight for a name, and then now the recall.
Vote yes, recall Madison!
We came over here for democracy, but when democracy is taken away from us, we are really angry and we want that back. And Madison took that away from us, and the recall will teach her a lesson.
Despite a massive recall effort led by anti-communist Vietnamese Americans, voters chose to keep Madison Nguyen in office.
District 7 voters, thank you so much. The majority of the voters have spoken loud and clear with the votes tonight. Let me raise my voice on this historic night with the thousands of yours and say, we did it!
But Madison's victory and desire to remain in politics come at an expensive price.
Even now, I which is really sad, but I'll share with you anyways. My in-laws, they're still living in Vietnam right now, and I was recently married, and my father-in-law had a stroke about 2 months ago, and so I wanted to have the opportunity to go back, but I can't because I know that if I go back now, imagine what's going to happen when I come back here to San Jose.
I think we're still far away from room for people who sympathy to supporting what's going on in Vietnam.
While this community still has its hardliners, Madison Nguyen's victory represents a significant shift in the thoughts and attitudes of Vietnamese Americans.
You cannot solve today's problem with the mindset of 40 years ago. I'm a Navy officer myself, and I serve to my very best. But I'm no longer a Navy officer, and that is the truth. I have to live with it.
They have to give up their pride, their sense of identity. They have to give up their country itself. They have to give up a lot. They have to give up their whole soul, their personality.
And some do not have such ability to recognize that this is who they are, this is what they are, and this is the new life. And the main difference like that create a lot of byproducts. And this victory means that we are about to ready for healing and reconciling.
Let's hope now we're not going to be murdered for it, but you could have your home vandalized, you could have your business vandalized, you could have rhetoric spread throughout the community, rumors that you're a communist, and don't go to that person's restaurant, don't buy that person's newspaper, don't buy that artist's art because they support the communists. I think if things in Vietnam are to change, then there's got to be, unfortunately, whether the people that suffer through this want to acknowledge or not, there has to be open dialogue. Because I think about Lam particularly, was he really a communist? I don't know. I mean, or was he just an average American kid who happened to be Vietnamese, who was educated in a liberal environment and kind of followed the same thought process that most American young people did at that time? And what could he have maybe become? What could he maybe have done? Look what he did in the short time that he was here. I mean, he created that community center for Vietnamese refugees that to this day still exists and serves the community.
Part of the tragedy of his death is I think he had so much more to give. I think he was the best and the brightest that the community had to offer. And there was just so much more that he could have done that he didn't have the opportunity to.
I tried for over 2 years to interview one of Lum's siblings for this film, but they all declined, saying that they have children and don't want to bring harm to their family. It's been 3 decades since Lum's death, but his siblings believe it is still unsafe to speak publicly about their brother. If Lum was alive today, is there anything you would want to say to him?
Oh, I would say, God, a lot. I mean, first of all, it's like, he should, for better or worse, should take the credit that who I am today, is have a lot to do with the way how he treated me.
You can take a moment and think about it, but are there things that you would want to try to talk to him about, or?
Well, I think I would say just say thank you. And I would say that he should run for supervisor for District 6, right? Representing the Tenderloin area. Yeah. No, I would just say thank you.
Ta Do continues to work in the Tenderloin. She is now a union organizer. Much has changed in the Tenderloin since the late 1970s when Lum lived here. Many of the Vietnamese refugees have moved out. No one here really remembers Lum anymore. His name and image are no longer attached to the youth center he founded. Yet a lantern parade Lum started over 30 years ago continues in the community. Known in Vietnamese as Tết Trung Thu, this autumn holiday is both a celebration and a prayer for the completeness of life. It is dark outside, except for the glow of lanterns.